World War I is among the least documented wars, and the stories of those brave Halifax and Halifax County men have been lost. Because all of the vets are no longer alive, oral history and interviews are out of the question. When you lose people who are part of that history, you lose their stories. This year I was researching an article in the 1960 Morning Chronicle, and while scrolling through the pages I kept stopping and reading articles of men who died at the front. Most headlines I came across were in bold print: "Another Halifax boy killed," or "Halifax County boy killed at front." It was reading these articles that made me realize that I did not know how many of our young men had actually been killed or wounded in the war. Now, if I didn't know the answer, I realized that most people from our communities in Halifax did not know either. It was then that I started photocopying these articles and taking them home to read. Within a short time, I had at least 50 stories on just the men from the Halifax area, and that was just in 1 year of the war. That is why I did this book, so you and I, and my grandchildren, will always remember what these great men did for us. We must never forget. In 1914, Halifax began playing a major role in the First War, both as the departure point for Canadian soldiers heading overseas and as an assembly point for all convoys. The city also served as the returning point for a steady stream of wounded soldiers returning on hospital ships. The majority of Canada's 400,000 servicemen sent to the European front by the end of 1917 passed through Halifax. On the home front, women had to cope with the absence of their husbands, fathers, and brothers, and on the war's end, with the effects of trauma on the men in their lives. These stories tell of the anxiety that the loved ones at home were going through, the telegram that was delivered, knowing that their son, husband, father, or brother was either wounded or killed, the letters that were received from these men, so full of love and encouragement, hiding their fears that they might be killed in the next hour. Back at home, mothers waited for news of their sons. Mrs. Annie Ambrose of Halifax is one of the splendid mothers of Nova Scotia. She has given 4 sons to the great cause of freedom and empire, having one, the youngest, Private Thomas Ambrose, killed in action, 2 others wounded in battle, and a 4th away in England. Can you imagine the feelings that the mothers and the wives were going through when they received a telegram? Mrs. Annie Carr of Bilby Street received this letter telling of the death of her son, John William Carr, after false reports and letters. Dear Mrs. Carr, I am so sorry to have to tell you that your son, William J.W. Carr, was killed by a shell on June the 2nd, 1916. His body was afterwards found and reburied. I cannot find out if anything was found in his clothing, but suppose that after the lapse of time, the body was hardly in condition to do much searching. Trusting you will accept my deepest sympathy, and that this will bring of some little comfort to you. Mr. E.S. Tracy, whose son William Tracy was killed on September the 30th, 1916, replied to a reporter on hearing of his son's death. God knows we loved our only boy. He was the idol of our home, but I prefer that he should lie in a hero's grave than walk the streets of Halifax, a coward and a shrinker, like hundreds of our young men are doing today. The folks at home did not realize that their men would not return as the person who went over there. Cases of shell shock, a mental disorder related to extreme stress and exposure to heavy explosions, were common during the periods of bombing in the Western Front. They were traumatized, were unable to carry on as soldiers, and many returned home a shell of the person that once was. There were cases of men who were executed for desertion or refusing an order to fight, when in fact they were experiencing shell shock. Mustard gas caused a lot of casualties on the Western Front. The skin of the victims of mustard gas blistered. Their eyes became very sore, and they began to vomit. Mustard gas caused internal and external bleeding and attacked the bronchial tubes. This was very painful. Many soldiers fighting in the First War suffered from trench feet. This was an infection of the feet caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions. Men stood for hours on end in waterlogged trenches without being able to remove their wet socks or boots. The feet would gradually go numb, and the skin would turn red or blue. In 1918 and 1919, the deadly influenza or Spanish flu pandemic erupted during the final stages of the First War. The pandemic affected everyone. With 1/4 of the U.S. and 1/5 of the world infected with the flu, it was impossible to escape from the illness. The fall of 1918, as our troops returned from the First War, they brought home the silent killer that would afflict 1 in 6 Canadians. After years at the front, returning soldiers could not embrace their loved ones. Anxious wives would meet husbands at the station, unable to touch them or even get near. For the soldier, just being wounded could easily be a life or death situation, no matter the extent of the injury. Advancing troops were not allowed to stop or care for the wounded soldier. All men carried emergency field dressing and, if possible, attempted to treat their own wounds. The wounded soldier then had to wait until the stretcher bearers arrived. Penicillin did not exist until after the war, and there were no antibiotics. Ether or chloroform was used as an anesthetic, and morphine as the main painkiller. With the war raging, Halifax families tried to cope with the hardships of their men being overseas or returning on hospital ships to be nursed back to health. But to add to those awful times, there was a great disaster. On December the 6th, 1917, 2 ships collided in Halifax Harbor, and 6 square kilometers of Halifax was simply wiped out. The explosion killed 2,000 people and wounded another 9,000. These returning soldiers got out of their sick beds to help dig through the ruins, looking for survivors. On that very day, a hospital ship with 1,000 wounded soldiers was returning to Halifax. Out of the 3 military hospitals, 1 was destroyed and 1 was badly damaged. Canadian dead were buried in small military plots across the lines. After the war, the bodies were buried in large Commonwealth war graves across France and Belgium. There are 13 Canadian battlefield memorials in France and Belgium. The names of our soldiers, whose last resting places are unknown, are inscribed on the Vimy Memorial and the Commonwealth Memorial. These pictures tell the stories of our Halifax men in the Great War. I wrote this book in memory of all Halifax and Halifax County men who fought, were wounded, or killed, that you and I would have a better life, that our country would have peace. World War I was a cruel war, and one that we hope will never happen again.